Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarika Carey. I'm the director of Edinburgh Art Festival, and we're so pleased to be returning this year with a programme of 35 exhibitions and new commissions across the city. As a highlight of our opening programme, it is a great pleasure to welcome you all to our 2021 keynote lecture. Over the years, in a long-running partnership with the National Galleries of Scotland and British Council Scotland, we've been proud to hear from artists including Nalini Milani, Alfredo Jar, Shilpa Gupta, Elm Green and Dragset, and Cardiff and Miller. And this year, in the first digital presentation of the keynote lecture, we're delighted to be joined by the internationally acclaimed artist and filmmaker Isaac Julien and Celeste Marie Bernier. We're honoured to be presenting the UK and European premiere of Isaac Julien's Lessons of the Hour as a highlight of the 2021 Festival Commissions programme. And I'm now going to hand to my colleague and close collaborator on this project, Stephanie Strain, Senior Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Scottish National Gallery of Modern Art, to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Sarika. It is my pleasure to introduce this evening's event. The first part is a specially recorded conversation filmed in the music hall at Edinburgh's Assembly Rooms, followed by a live Q&A. This beautiful historic space was the venue for numerous speeches by the 19th century abolitionist, intellectual, and self-liberated freedom fighter Frederick Douglass, notably the occasion of May 1st, 1846, when he addressed an audience of over 2,000 people. Isaac Julien's film portrait of Frederick Douglass, Lessons of the Hour, is now on view at the Scottish National Gallery of Modern Art until the 10th of October. I really hope you'll all have the chance to experience this work in person. It is really incredible to do so. You can book your free tickets online at nationalgalleries.org. As Sarika mentioned, we're honoured to present the exhibition in partnership with Edinburgh Art Festival as the UK and European premiere of this 10-screen film installation. It feels very appropriate to host this work here in Edinburgh, as the city where Douglass lived in the mid-1840s, and also as one of the key filming locations for Lessons of the Hour. From his address at 33 Gilmore Place, Douglass travelled across the country to address large crowds in towns and cities as Scotland's anti-slavery agent. We are immensely grateful for the collaboration of Celeste Marie Bernier, one of the world's leading Douglass scholars and Professor of United States and Atlantic Studies and Personal Chair in English Literature at the University of Edinburgh. She worked closely with Isaac Julien on Lessons of the Hour to construct tableaux vivants that reimagined Douglass's relationships to a range of key historical figures, including Anna Murray Douglass, Helen Pitts, and the suffragette Susan B. Anthony. On behalf of Edinburgh Art Festival and the National Galleries of Scotland, I offer my thanks to Isaac and Celeste for sharing their conversation around Frederick Douglass, his legacy, his impact on Scotland, and the urgency today of his activism, philosophy, and ways of seeing the world. Now to formally introduce our two speakers. Professor Celeste Marie Bernier is author of over 20 monographs, essay collections, and special issues, and over 35 essays and book chapters. And she's also the curator of 6 American and UK travelling exhibitions. Just a few of her extensive publications include Stick to the Skin, African American and Black British Art, 1865 to 2015, If I Survive, the Anna Murray and Frederick Douglass Family Papers, and Douglass Family Lives. She was winner of an International African American History and Genealogical Society Maryland Book Award, amongst many other honours, and has delivered over 250 guest lectures and plenaries. She's held numerous academic fellowships at universities including Oxford, Harvard, Yale, King's College London, the National Centre for Humanities in Durham, North Carolina, and the Obama Institute in Mainz, Germany. Celeste is currently leading a 3-year international Leverhulme-funded interdisciplinary research project titled Sacrifice is Survival: Black Families Fighting for Freedom in the USA and Canada, 1735 to 1936. Professor Isaac Julien, CBE-RA, is a critically acclaimed British artist and filmmaker. As well as our show at NGS, he is currently exhibiting Lina Bo Bardi, A Marvelous Entanglement, at Santo Cento Panorama Madrid, which is on view until the 29th of August 2021. And previously this work was shown at Maxi in Rome last year. Other recent solo exhibitions include Isaac Julien Lessons of the Hour at the McAvoy Foundation for the Arts in San Francisco, Western Union Small Boats at the Neuberger Museum, New York in 2020, Looking for Langston at Tate Britain 2019, and Playtime at LACMA Los Angeles in 2019 as well. Julien's work is held in numerous public collections, including Tate, the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum in New York, Centre Pompidou in Paris, Luma Foundation Arles, Kramlich Collection San Francisco, and Zeitz Museum of Contemporary Art Africa, Cape Town. Amongst the many books and catalogues published on his work are a biography, Isaac Julien Riot, which was published by MoMA in 2013 to coincide with the museum's presentation of his 9-screen installation, 10,000 Waves. Isaac Julien is Professor of Digital Arts at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where he and Professor Mark Nash established the Isaac Julien Lab, Santa Cruz. Finally, I would like to mention the major new publication due out this autumn, Lessons of the Hour, Frederick Douglass, which has been co-edited by Isaac with Cora Gilroy Ware, and essays by Celeste Marie Bernier, Henry Louis Gates Jr., Paul Gilroy, Vron Ware, and Deborah Willis. Isaac and Celeste's conversation will last for around 40 minutes, after which they'll be back to join us live and take questions from the audience. Now over to the assembly rooms.
Well, it's such a joy and a privilege to be here in the Music Hall in Edinburgh, one of the spaces and places where Frederick Douglass loved to give speeches. And in thinking about Douglass as the world-leading orator that he was, a person who chose spaces and places for how they could be a platform for activism. To be in this music hall today and to understand Douglass as a speaker here, joined by many more self-liberated campaigners fighting against injustices, is a real privilege to think about Douglass in this space, talking and speaking back to atrocities and abuses suffered by family members in slavery, but also it was here that he really began to think about what Black liberation meant and what it meant as an activist tool in understanding the history of heroism. And understanding a history of Black heroism is very powerful in understanding your beautiful poetic meditation on what liberation and the fight and the struggle against slavery is today. And especially in understanding the powerful intercutting in your film with history and political injustices in the past with political atrocities in the present. And the powerful way in which you end the film, Isaac, around the Baltimore that Douglass knew and the Baltimore we know today.
I must say this is such a fantastic moment for me to be able to be here with you to have a discussion about the making of Lessons of the Hour, because in some ways a lot of it starts with you, Celeste, actually.
You're being too kind again, Isaac. Bless you.
Really, it does, because I mean, I came across these amazing documents which you had been, in a way, always involved in relationship to reading about Douglass, and so many publications and kind of journals. And then when I found out that you actually lived in Edinburgh, I just couldn't believe it, you know. And in a way, all of these things became, in a way, incredibly pertinent because, of course, Douglass lived in Scotland. And so to actually be here in the assembly rooms, which is, of course, where Douglass spoke.
In being here with you is a dream come true, Isaac, and being a part of the beautiful, beautiful poetic meditation that is Lessons of the Hour is a gift that keeps on giving. And you single-handedly, in the 30 years I've been dedicating my life to Douglass over this period, you've brought Douglass and the Douglass family and the power of the ancestral force of radicalism, resistance, and fighting injustice by any means necessary back with us in the 21st century. And Douglass's spirit in the 19th century century, as he spoke here repeatedly to audiences, was to galvanize the power of the African diasporic freedom struggle in the face of atrocity, in the face of annihilation, in the face of torture and death. And so Douglas's mission in Scotland was one to enlighten, was one to tell audiences in Scotland that they need to understand that their nation is built on blood, and was one of liberation. And in Lessons of the Hour, you speak to the lessons he taught then, and you speak to the lessons we need now, and the lessons we need in the future, at the same time that you honor the freedom struggle, the intergenerational black liberation movement that was the entire Douglas family, not just Frederick Douglass, but also Anna Murray Douglas, his wife and partner of 44 years, and their children, as a life force in the liberation movement you bring to life in your beautiful films.
You know, your scholarship was really at the forefront of our minds when we were sort of undertaking the kind of initial research. And in some ways, I guess the journey begins with going to Rochester and being approached by the amazing curator, John Hanhart, who, with Jonathan Binstock, basically commissioned me, and walking around Rochester, which was actually John Hanhart's home, and coming across the statue of Douglas in Highland Park. I mean, in a way, it was just done. I mean, you know, he's buried in Rochester, and I was like, okay, Frederick Douglass, this is a project I have to do. But I mean, these kind of beginnings, of course, in a way, become very clouded quickly because, you know, he was such a kind of monumental figure, you know, and how would one go about it anyway? I mean, really, so it was really kind of that kind of wonderful pictorial book on Douglas, which he was the editor of, and that I began to realize, yes, I had read Frederick Douglass and come across him through the writings of Skip Gates initially, but then it's really when I read your work that I became really activated in relationship to Douglas. And of course you live here in Edinburgh, you know. You are doing all of this amazing research in Edinburgh as well. And so you was really our key locutor in this project. And when we came here, and I remember kind of, for example, when Ray Fairron met you, who of course plays Douglas. I mean, I think that meeting with you and Ray Fairron, I mean, was kind of dynamite. I mean, I think he completely understood Douglas after your conversation. You know.
I think he beautifully understood. I mean, just how he plays Douglas and brings his spirit to life. And I think one of the key aspects we spoke about so powerfully, and what you speak to now, is Douglas as the monument, Douglas as the memorial, and Douglas as the human being in the struggle. And what Douglas lived with all his life and was burdened with all his life was the public Frederick Douglass and the private Frederick Douglass. And Ray Fairron captures beautifully, hypnotically and powerfully Douglas's powerful persona as the unrivaled orator, the unrivaled speaker, the unrivaled testifier to the atrocities in slavery, as a way then to become a platform for liberation. When he pauses and holds back in one of those final moments of the film, he also remembers and does justice to those who died. And what we spoke about so much was Douglas makes it out of slavery at 20, but all his life he remembers his brothers, his sisters, his mother, those who died in slavery. And it's the power of your film in photography, in memorialization, in the way in which you have that black canvas come behind Douglas to replace that Arcadian natural scene, does an incredible justice to Douglas the individual and the mortal human being. As we know, in the 21st century, white supremacy trades in monuments, in icons, in there can be only one. And Douglas's black liberation manifesto was that there is all of us, there are millions. And what's so powerful in your poetic meditation is that memorialization of the struggle in the past, in the present, and what we need to do in the future. And that idea of the Douglass memory and the Douglass family through relationships comes through so beautifully in how you think of him and how you represent and reimagine him to us as a person taking trains, as a person in pain missing his family, as a person fighting against segregation in his day-to-day existence, let alone the war and the battleground that was slavery. So your film does beautiful justice to Douglass as that protester, and what you beautifully memorialise too is Douglass in Scotland as a person who's sitting by the fire in the York Hotel, just come back from Glasgow and satisfied, writing to a friend saying, Scotland is all ablaze with anti-slavery excitement. So you tell us all those struggles, from the pain to the power in his life.
You know, what was his life like in Scotland? And I think sort of, you know, exactly what you've just said, and the relationship to travelling and his relationship to horses, you know, to animals, and horses in particular. I mean, this was also like a very key element, and in some ways, I think it loops into a lot of debates around sort of nature and culture, around the kind of principles that Douglass was interested in terms of, in a sense, the different religions that he observed, the Quakerism as a form of meditation in his life, and the way in which he also, I think, imbues some of these sort of modern ideas, if you like, about the way in which nature and animals in particular have their own ecological equilibrium in relationship to humans. I think this way of thinking about humans in relationship to questions which resonate around, if you like, slavery, and that view of looking at animals from that perspective, which I think, in a way, challenges maybe some of the more kind of utopian ideas around sort of humans and animals in a philosophical sense. I think Douglass, in a way, poses these questions in a really quite amazing way, and this gave me the kind of, if you like, fuel and energy to be able to pursue that as a kind of image in the creation of the image in relationship to Douglass and imagining Douglass in Scotland. But I think the real aspect to Douglass, which was really quite amazing for me, and that came out of a lot of the scholarship which you've been involved in and others, is his relationship to photography. And so I think the fact that he's writing about photography, that he's developing his own aesthetic theories about photography, that this is not something which is part of, contemporary art history. Well, it's not, certainly not part of, art history per se, but it's not, in a way, positioned in the way that it could necessarily be positioned. And I think this is where kind of, if you like, Douglass's interest in art and the kind of emancipatory aspect of photography as an apparatus for liberation becomes key in relationship to one's own practice, and how that, in a way, symbolizes the ways in which I'm going to think about creating that. And of course, his whole commitment to journalism, writing about photographers like J.P. Ball, the great J.P. Ball, who took photographs of Queen Victoria or Charles Dickens. I mean, we need to find those photographs somewhere, wherever they exist as, photogravures or tintypes. We need to find out where they are, because obviously he was such an amazing photographer. But of course he worked on the Underground, railroad as well, and so kind of that whole aspect of liberation and the kind of freedom fighter aspect of, liberating people from being slaves into free people, is where they conjoin. So it's not just the relationship to aesthetics, but how it makes it part of the whole way in which we can have this renewed interest in photography.
The love of pictures stands first among our passional inclinations, and is among the last to forsake us in our pilgrimage here. It is said that the best gifts are the most abused.
I think one of the ways in which I was really trying to look at the archive was this whole question around the way in which, of course, Douglas is the most photographed man of the 19th century, as it so happens, you know, more photographed than people like Abraham Lincoln. But I think, of course, one of the things which I kept thinking about was really his wife, Anna Murray Douglas, and the fact that my interest in photography led to the fact there were so few representations of Anna Murray Douglas. And so in the work, what I've tried to do is to revalorize that and to rearticulate the archive, I guess in a revisionist manner, but I see it as being something which is fairly progressive, as recentering Anna Murray Douglas. And Lady of the Lake, of course, the portrait is part of that, of really foregrounding her role in relationship to the ways in which they, as a family, worked as a team. Her whole story, that she was a free slave, that she was an incredible organizer, and the fact that she was an incredible seamstress and had all of these sartorial skills, you know. I mean, she literally, in a way, is making Douglas's kind of, you know, reimagined self, at least in a sartorial sense. And so all of that becomes really important, and that's why I really focused on the aspect of sewing and that as a technology and apparatus versus that of the train and that as a kind of other apparatus of modernity. These two modernities are at work, and Anna Murray Douglas and her role is really pertinent for me. And so that's one of the aspects I was trying to readdress, because of course, you know, the North Star, that was all sort of a family effort.
One of the greatest compliments Douglas could ever pay an image was if it could speak. He said, "I love images when they speak to me." And in your beautiful reimagining of Anna Murray Douglas, she speaks. And we have few images of Anna Murray Douglas. She herself was a phenomenal orator, and we have very few words that she spoke. But even the very few words we have, one of them being, "Why not I endure hardship that my race may be free," speaks to the power of her life as an activist. Douglas really believed that agitation is art and art is agitation, and he believed that pictures are a power. And beautifully, as you do in your film, as he did, he believed in the visual mode as itself a weapon of revolution. And part of Douglas's endless tiredness was the ways in which he had to galvanize and work with not only a white racist pro-slavery South, but a white anti-slavery racist North. And Douglas believed that art was the way out. He had a philosophy, as you beautifully say, Isaac, where he understood that art is agitation, was the artery of his manifesto, the artery of his life existence, and it was the only way in which an enslaved person of any age struggling for survival in slavery across the African diasporic world could become a human being. As he said, this is how we move from chattel records to be bought and sold in white racist imaginaries to become our own revolution through works of art. And one of Douglas's endless phrases, he says, "When you see a child looking at a work of art, tell me they are not entitled to human rights." So Douglas had a philosophy that art wasn't in any way an additional thing. It was an artery of activism. And that in his photographs, as you beautifully memorialize, he's memorializing himself and his struggle, but he's memorializing the struggle of millions. He survived. His struggle was to remember the suffering of those who didn't, and those who continued to survive and to fight for survival, whether in the 19th century or today.
I mean, it's so interesting, isn't it? Because I think, you know, even in one's own practice, I'm thinking about the ways in which technology and the moving image and photography can become albums of, in a way, trying to progress particular causes, but at the same time I'm thinking about the aesthetics of those as a form of giving subjectivity to, if you like, subjects who have not always had access to them. So, of course, the beginning of my work begins really on that as a premise. You know, it's about trying to, in a way, look at the sort of apparatus and look at the ways in which photography and film can enlighten subjects and enlighten people and give them a certain autonomy, agency. I think this question of agency is something which is so central to Douglas and the way in which he views photography and the way in which photography, indeed, even to this very day, as a technology, is the apparatus that is, in a way, creating, for example, the whole Black Lives Matter movement. You know, it's a documentation of the atrocity that took place in terms of what happened sort of last year in that horrible sort of murdering of George Floyd, and then the way in which basically we think about the power of that technology, and in the same way that it can also have its very damaging effects as well, which I think Douglas is also aware of. But I think there's a way in which we don't really, I think, appreciate enough the ways in which his philosophy really enabled one to really grapple with these questions in a way that are so relevant for today. And I think that's what I'm trying to display in Lessons of the Hour. I mean, of course, it's a 10-screen work. It does exist as a single-screen film. I don't have a prejudice against classical films, but in this installation, it's a 10-screen work, and it's a way of trying to utilize the new technologies and the question of bricolage and montage effects as a way of really propelling a different way of looking. And I think that different way of looking connects to that very beginning in the work, where Douglas talks about the way that he's looking at nature and trees and the way they imbue a kind of very terroristic aspect to the way that he's going to look, and that critical looking then becomes very much part of his way in which he examines and views the world. And so I think that sense of having a critical way of looking at the world is why, you know, I make work, and why this is indeed a 10-screen work, which has a certain radicality to it, a scenography and a way of trying to build into the pictures this sense of rupture and also sublimity, but at the same time to use those to cast and look back into history, a history that, if you like, in the 21st century, I would say in the West we've been resisting, but nonetheless haunts the spectre of all our actions and everything that we do. And I think that's so clearly the case today.
I think that's a beautiful and powerful way of understanding and doing justice to what Douglas was doing then and what he means now. And certainly Douglas carried all his life what he felt was a burden of representation and a burden to bear witness. And in terms of understanding slavery, his commitment was to understanding not only the legal fact of slavery, but in Lessons of the Hour, he talks about the rise of the spirit of mastery, the rise of the spirit of slavery. And so for Douglas, slavery as a physical form of incarceration was its legal identification, but its reality in white supremacy, in white racist ideology, in white racist caricaturing and stereotyping, in all the violences and violations of a persecutory white racist world. As he understood it, the fight and the war was on every front. And what's so powerful in your poetic meditation is Douglas's own looking and visualizing at nature. And one point he always returned to in all his speeches is he would tell his audiences, I have been beaten far more for how I looked than what I said. And so Douglass would say to his audiences, tonight you will see it from the slave's point of view. So when he is in Edinburgh, when he is in Aberdeen, when he is in Montrose, Douglass is committed to bringing, as he says, these are his words, the slave's point of view, the slave's experience, again his words, into the room, into the music hall. And in understanding Douglass's relationship to agitation and to art, and thinking through especially what beauty means, Douglass had a whole philosophy that European art was based and rooted and made possible in atrocities committed to millions of people living in slavery across the African diaspora. So he absolutely understood the blood money of the Western art world made possible by suffering and subjugation. And what you said so beautifully and powerfully, Isaac, around subjectivity, that was Douglass's whole life's mission with photography, that photography and art was a way to become subjects, to walk away from the objectification of the racist world of slavery and its spirit, and also a way to become the work of art, and as he says, to revolutionize vision, to change seeing, to change perception, and to reorder the world from the enslaved person's point of view, to bring radical black subjectivities as a stimulus to revolution.
Well, that's incredible. I think it's incredible that your kind of research and work into Douglass and how that resonates today is extraordinary, I think, because we're still in this particular moment, aren't we? We're still struggling in relationship to these questions around humanity. Can black subjects be seen in this particular manner? Questions of indigeneity. All of these things are so kind of part of a whole, discourse and a set of policies and practices which resonate deeply, I think, in our culture today. And I'm thinking about this, of course, because we're now in the assembly rooms where Douglass spoke, and you probably know the lectures that he gave here, right?
I know one or two. So in many of the speeches he gave here, you and I are sitting in this room, but we need to imagine in 1846, the windows would be open, there would be 2,000 people in this room and thousands on the street outside. And Douglass started to get really weary of the white paternalist racist context he was in. And his philosophy of art was very much related to his philosophy of activism, which was about give us equal human rights. And so his war against anti-slavery white campaigners was his war against them seeing him as a political object and not a human subject. So Douglass's interest in photography was reclaiming the subject, reclaiming equality. And here he spoke not about himself in one of his speeches. He decides to, as he speaks about pictures and power on the eve of civil war, he decided to speak about black heroism on an enslaving ship going across the Atlantic. And what he does is he speaks about a man called Madison Washington, who's born into slavery and becomes one of the world iconic black liberating figures in US history. And Douglass, before the audience of thousands here, would say, in 10 minutes, Madison Washington was master of that ship, and all the crew lay at his feet. And so that word of master and mastery and understanding what power is and reclaiming from white power and replacing it with black power based in an egalitarian philosophy of human rights was Douglass's lifeblood and was in all the speeches he gave in places like this.
I mean, it's extraordinary the way in which he also mastered language, in a sense, if we're thinking about this dialectically, and the way that his interest, for example, in Shakespeare propelled, for example, I think, the performance of Ray Fearon, who is a Royal Shakespearean actor. And basically there's a way in which I think when Ray understood that Douglass, was interested, he said, well, I can see the Shakespearean influences in the text, in the work, and I think that sense of oratory, but also the way in which he was able to utilize language and, in a way, transcend these boundaries into enabling certain identification with the audience. I mean, in a sense, all that Ray Ferron does is to kind of, in a way, perform his words, but with a certain oratory, of course. And I think there was something when we were in the Royal Academy, because we were, in a sense, trying to pretend we were in Scotland or in Edinburgh, but we weren't. But I think in terms of the sort of architecture, the iconography, all of these things felt kind of familiar. And I think that was something that really became a really important aspect in terms of also another way in which Douglas was able to create this kind of resonance, you know, and I think how that resonance continues in the performative gestures which are given into the work. And I think that also is something which is very much in our thinking and reading against the grain, for example, of biographies about Douglas, when we think about the questions of gender and how they kind of get played out, you know, because one of the things in the piece, which was really important for me, was really the role of Anna Murray Douglas and the way in which that she too had this incredible kind of persona and resonance.
11 days and a half gone, and I have crossed 3,000 miles of the perilous deep. Instead of the bright blue sky of America, I am covered with soft gray fog. I breathe, and lo, the chattel becomes a man.
I mean, the film does just such power, and Ray Ferron, Frederick Douglass's spirit lives again in Ray Ferron, and the power of language, as you beautifully say, in Douglass's life and his commitment. And as a person who wrote over 7,000 speeches, narratives, and was a virtuoso of the spoken and written word, what's so powerful in how you interpret and imagine and recreate that for us, Isaac, is you do justice to Frederick Douglass, the free man, as he described himself in this city, and also, as he remembered, Frederick Bailey, the slave. And these are his words. Douglass said, as he's walked the streets of Edinburgh, I feel myself a new man. Frederick Douglass is a very different man to Frederick Bailey, the slave. And what's so powerful in Ray Ferron's performance, and what's so powerful in the lexicon of liberation, as Donald Rodney would say in the film that you've created, is exactly the ways in which Frederick Bailey lives in Frederick Douglass. And certainly Douglass felt all his life that white supporters, even the most well-intentioned, carried paternalism and racism to such a degree that they only understood Frederick Douglass and they didn't understand Frederick Bailey. And similarly, the way in which white racist injustices play out today, we know Frederick Douglass's name if we're lucky, as he knew we would if he was lucky, whilst he knew that the millions who died would be nameless, faceless and bodiless, again his words. But who knows Anna Murray Douglas's name? Anna Murray Douglas, his wife for 44 years, a freedom fighter, a liberator, a philosopher, an orator, a singer, a chef, a human rights activist, a seamstress, a fashion designer, a person who made Frederick Douglass and the Douglas family, they had 5 children, who were all social justice, radical activists, liberation figures, as Kenneth Morris Jr. describes them, the collective of liberation that was the Douglas family. And so your film beautifully memorializes the struggles of Douglass as Frederick Douglass and as Frederick Bailey that haunted him all his life, and also the pain he knew that his family's struggles, their liberation activism, would leave no historical trace. And so your film is an act of reclamatory justice in the way that you are speaking back to white racism today, white supremacy today, and the ways in which Frederick Douglass, there can be only one, when the Douglas family was an intergenerational movement of liberation that reflected generations of millions of people across the diasporic world today.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, it's incredible, and it's incredibly moving, I think. In the work, I think I was trying to, you know, just reference some of these aspects, and I guess they get referenced in the scene where you have Anna Murray Douglas making Douglas's fabulous blue coat. And basically, you get the different modernities, him on the train, and the way in which that as a kind of technology is enabling him to move, her sewing, and how that as a technology is enabling her to refashion Douglas, and in that combination, in this moment, the suturing of the different images and the connections I'm trying to make across space and time and geography is connected to this question of the desire for liberation and how that looks and feels. I think that question of viscerality and the feeling of Douglas is something that becomes very important, that you need to, if you're making works of art and films in this case, or images, you need a certain aliveness to make that connection to these questions. Because, of course, reading a book is important, but then, in a way, when you want to create a certain form of activism, which, of course, Douglas was, to realize that there's this line of activism to what's happening today in Black Lives Matter to Douglas, I think it gives a certain, if you like, sort of elegance or kind of history, lineage, respect to those kind of struggles which have been galvanizing for so long. And obviously, this is where I think Scotland becomes very important in sharing that as a kind of legacy, because I think, of course, Douglas chose Scotland, not England, to reside in, And today, I think we can say that Scotland leads the way in relationship to thinking about certain questions in a way that England doesn't, I think, which makes me very happy to be here too. And I think there's a way in which it feels very right that we have Lessons of the Hour making its premiere, its European premiere, but its UK premiere here in Scotland. I think Douglas would have approved of that.
I am now, as you will perceive by the date of this letter, in Old Scotland. Almost every hill, river, mountain, and lake of which has been made classic by the heroic deeds of her noble sons.
All those 150 years ago, Douglas described it as, my life's mission is to wake Scotland up to the atrocities of slavery. And when he's in this city, he's very much part of a campaign to fight against white Scottish ministers who are taking blood money from white enslavers in the US South. And he leads a famous campaign against the Free Church of Scotland. And as he says, never was a church more ironically named, the Free Church of Scotland. He said, that gave hope to us in the Maryland, but what is your actual Free Church of Scotland? And he campaigned against them, and he campaigned against their injustices, and he made sure the streets of Edinburgh had the words written on them, send back the bloodstained money. And in your beautiful film, you memorialize that legacy of activism when he and white Quakers climb up Arthur's Seat and carve send back the money into the land of Scotland. And so Douglas... I
think in our film we poetic license, it's scrawled in the sand,
But they both work, because the scrolling in the sand speaks so powerfully too. Douglas said at one point, I saw that slogan everywhere. I saw it in Arbroath at the train station, I saw it in the city of Edinburgh, whether it's on the sand or on the mountain. Douglas said that the hills and mountains of Scotland were alive with that slogan. And Douglas, in all his speeches in Scotland, said, there is not a valley or a river that is not doused in the blood of the battle of the fight for freedom. So he understood Scotland as a nation profiting from slavery, but he said, even the old dogs of Scotland know I am free. So he also saw the possibilities of Scotland as a land of liberation. And he saw both of them as a land of liberation, mired in the profits of enslavement, but on the other hand, a nation with the possibility of freedom. And he, at every moment, in every hall, whether it was here or in speeches, would crowd out audiences saying, you can be better, you can live a new life of liberty. And that, I think, was something he didn't see in England.
It's so interesting. And when we came across the kind of songs like the Send Back the Money songs. I mean, those folk songs are so amazingly moving and strong. I mean, I remember that when I first heard them, I couldn't really believe that there are actual songs where Douglas, you know, actually is the protagonist, really, of those songs. And, you know, it's so fantastic to be able to have those be in the work.
Send back the money, send it back, tempt not the Negro's God, to blast and weather Scotland's church with his avenging rod. There's no might in all the sun, but cries to heaven aloud, for wrath on all who shield the men that tread in Negro's blood.
In a sense, I think for audiences in the States who have seen the work, because it's been shown in Rochester, in New York, in San Francisco, in Savannah, I mean, I think they've been quite astonished to kind of understand Douglas, both in his very powerful oratory self, but to realize that he was a kind of, you know, transnational kind of, you know, freedom fighter, that he was someone who had made these amazing interventions into Scottish culture. His work was translated into German culture. I mean, I think, and all of these, this sort of transnational Douglas, which is also Douglas I'm interested in, having Ottolin Assin, his sort of German translator, who's represented in the work. Of course, relationship to Susan B. Anthony, who's represented in the work, which of course there's an ambivalent relationship, but nonetheless, you know, there's a way in which, you know, before he died, he's given a talk, right, to the suffragette movement. That's his last lecture, you know. So, in a way, and then in the work, there's also an image of Rosetta Douglas. But anyway, we know that she's someone that is part of the Douglas family, is part of the team. That's really creating this possibility intergenerationally for Douglas to live on. And going to his house in Washington, that fantastic introduction that you gave me, Celeste, to his house. And I mean, I just found it incredible that his house still was standing, and the care and attention that was given to it in an area where maybe, you know, other things might not be given that care and attention. Everybody knows who Douglas is, and it's incredible to have this sort of house museum that one was able to have access to, and the kind of curatorial work that was being done in that space. It was just such an honor and privilege to be able to film in the space. And that's when I first heard you lecture as well.
The same it was there, now I remember it. What you just so beautifully summarized there is Douglas as the human rights activist, and you spoke earlier about an animal rights activist too, and you spoke to just now about his women's rights activism. And Douglas was committed all his life to all rights for all people of all nations, and as you said, it extended to the natural world and to animal rights. And what was often spoken of when people met Douglas was his kindness, first of all, and how he found suffering of any kind absolutely intolerable. So he lived his life as he spoke. He dedicated and sacrificed his life to his humanitarianism, his compassion, and thinking of his transnational life here on the streets of Scotland. He spoke about slavery, but his compassion was for people destitute on the streets and the cities of Scotland. And so the Send Back the Money songs that you described as so moving, Isaac, when I hear them, I hear the destitute children who follow Douglas and sing those words. And Douglas felt an awe in children who had nothing, who gave everything that they had of that nothing. Children helped him carve out his Send Back the Money signs. Children who were living destitute, penniless and starving at the foot of Arthur's Seat helped him. And so Douglas believed believed that the world was a world of human rights. And as you speak so beautifully too about his house, where his family lived, where Rosetta, his eldest daughter, and Rosetta, who was an intellectual, political, philosophical figure in her own right, she was blind by the time she passed because she was proofreading his work for him. She was a researcher on Pictures and Power, and she herself had a mantra that she lived by: I refuse to be tyrannized over. So there was a liberationist movement of radical activists within his family that the house, and in your beautiful memorial to the house, you see that history and you see that legacy. And in the paintings that you show in the house, you see Seng Bei Pei, for example, who led the Amistad Revolution. So it's a real testament to the freedom movement across the generations in your beautiful film.
Yeah, I think there's a way in which maybe, you know, that we can think about the way that Douglass resonates for an audience today, and how that is going to be such an interesting sort of moment. You know, it's been so fantastic to have the opportunity to speak to you, Celeste, an honour, and also the fact that the work was invited to be shown here in Edinburgh as part of the Arts Festival is such an honour, you know, so...
I think the honour is all ours, Isaac, and the beauty and the power and the privilege and the life force of your film brings Douglass to life again, and the many Douglasses that were the Douglass Liberation Movement, and what they asked of society then and what they ask us in society now. So thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. We're live now with Isaac and Celeste to share some of our comments and questions from the audience. We've had lots of really interesting comments and observations coming in on the YouTube channel, so thanks to everybody. Elizabeth Williams posted that she loves the way the film foregrounds Anna Murray Douglass and how important she was. And this is really echoed in Lisa Rosenberg's comment that she feels Anna Murray Douglass was a core part of, and she puts in capital letters, the making of Frederick, his visual standing, the promotion of hearing and seeing him. The film gives us a step beyond those 19th century images. And Lisa then goes on to ask the question, which I think I might direct to both of you. She asks, can the white supremacism of the Western art world be overwritten, rewritten or reimagined by works such as Lessons of the Hour? How can the art world embrace activism to own its history of racism? Quite a meaty question to start off with.
Well, yes, it is. I mean, I think, you know, that in a way, I guess my answer to that question would be, in fact, there have always been artists working for quite some time who have been really at the forefront of really trying to pose questions which I think are connected to these themes that have become more, I guess, obvious in the 21st century. And I mean, I think even if we think about the history of Britain, we can see that the legacy of modernism always had artists of color who are working and making works. And I think there's a way in which the art world divided that world and ignored those practices, but those practices were still being made. And so, of course, the art world now is doing catch up to some of those things or activities. And so, of course, on the one hand, we have a Frank Bolin, but if we go back to kind of Moody and his amazing sculptures, or if we go, if you think about contemporary artists like Labena Hamid, for example, who is such a significant artist who, as a sort of Black woman artist, was really quite ignored. And her incredible, powerful work, which has only belatedly really been recognised, but I think was always being recognised by lots of other artists working and critics. And I think so, in a way, I think that's a question that has always been there, and perhaps it's just being paid a little bit more attention to. But whether or not, I think the whole institutional question is one that, in a way, I guess the white art establishment has to, in a way, answer itself. I mean, they it's for them to do that work. But I think, that some of that work is really been activated and been inspired by what happened last year and previously by those who are no longer with us, like Okwenwezo or Famagodin, people who pioneered curatorially lots of, I would say, possibilities in an art world context. And I think in Britain or in the UK, we have some way to go on some of those things. But I think obviously, there's Lessons of the Hour, but there's lots of other people working and making fantastic works. So it's just about conjoining all of those things and allowing all of those things to flourish and articulate.
I think it's really a beautifully expressed, Isaac, and Lessons of the Hour beautifully emblematizes these struggles and these revolutions. And mentioning Lubaina Himid, who dedicates her life to memorializing, resisting, representing lives lived inside the invisible. And that whole question of millennia and no less than centuries of African diasporic art making is resistance to white supremacist power. One of Douglas's favorite things to do on a Sunday was to go into the major white art galleries of DC and stage conversations and questions about what those paintings were doing on the walls, and would cause a revolution everywhere he went. And he saw it, his answer to that question would be, yes, they must, and they must do it instantly. And so he was not only having lots of pictures taken himself, but he was a philosopher and historian about the history of making and the history of Black radical art making as a fight against white supremacist power.
I mean, I remember coming across a wonderful article in the Frederick Douglass newspaper where he writes about James Presley Ball, J.P. Ball, which, of course, in the work I really tried to visually thematize his photographic studio and his practice. But I mean, of course, Douglass was really, he was really there writing about, in a way, Black artists at work, and I think that's incredible. And of course, we have our sort of writers that have been doing that work. I mean, Eddie Chambers is someone who's been doing that work. But I think also we've had, the work that you've done, Celeste, and many other critics who have been really sort of at the forefront of really making this kind of way of looking and just really illuminating these sort of art practices which have been sort of there for some time.
Thank you both. On the question of Celeste's scholarship, we have two further questions. The first from Elizabeth Williams, who asks Celeste, she'd love to hear more about Douglas's complicated relationship with the legacy of Robert Burns.
That's a powerful question. And how long do we have in the brief window of time that we have? Douglas was a lifelong admirer of Burns and loved Burns and saw Burns as a portal to what Scotland could be and needed to be, at the same time that he viscerally, emotionally, in his very heart's core, understood the problematics of Burns as a figure who was connected to and understood, as brilliant scholars working in this area, somebody who had a very problematic relationship to white enslavers in Scotland, white enslavers in the Caribbean. And Douglas never lost an opportunity to inform audiences with powerful figures like Burns, who created beautiful songs to tie it up to a revolutionary manifesto of protest and human rights. So Douglas always juxtaposed the reality of a person with the mythology of what they could be in the freedom struggle. And Burns was a touchstone for how Douglas, on the one hand, celebrated and eulogised Scotland as a land of liberty. At the same time, he understood Scotland steeped in a tradition built on the profits, as he described it, of the bodies and souls of women, men and children. So Douglas always understood the complex relationship and always held white figures accountable, whether they were popular figures working in protest songs and traditions. He nevertheless held them to the jugular vein of what their human rights was in practice, let alone what it was in myth and memory.
Thank you so much, Celeste. If we have time to do this, I'm squeezing one more question to you and then a final question to Isaac. So we'll run just slightly over, but I hope you agree it's definitely worth it. So Lisa Rilsenberg also asks Celeste, do you think that Douglas has become understood differently in light of Black Lives Matter? Has the response to your scholarship, Professor Bernard, and this film, Isaac, changed? And is it changing? And if so, how?
Depends who you speak to and when and where. That's another beautiful, powerful question. Just before he died, the day before he died, Douglas said, "My heart burns to see the people that I struggled for dying at the hands of police brutality, being persecuted at the hands of white supremacist ideology." And that was the day before he died. And he said, "I despair for my people." And so understanding Douglas and audiences now, Douglas's life was lived by the responsibility, the accountability, and what work we were going to do to improve an unfair, a racist and a persecutory world. So the activism of Douglas, the artery of the activism of Lessons of the Hour is, as it was for Douglas then, as it is for us now, a revolutionary call to arms. And Douglas's film that Isaac Julien creates is beautifully in that powerful call to arms tradition.
So this is a question from Alice H to you, Isaac. She asks, with such a monumental and important figure as Douglas, were there any particular challenges in selecting or narrowing down the focus for the film itself?
Well, I mean, in some ways, in terms of how I make works, not so much in the sense that when I'm shooting, I basically shoot, in a way, a stream of images. And it's only really in the sort of editing process that we begin to kind of focus. But we're focusing on the basis of a kind of deep visual research and also a research which involves a certain scholarship, which Celeste was so generous to share with us in the work. So I think, in a way, it's very much about trying to think about Douglas and how he can be rearticulated for a new generation, and to bring that out within the trajectory of his own activism and to connect that to today's activism. But I think, in a way, I mean, I'm interested in the process of aesthetic reparation or reparation of aesthetics as a way of trying to link and build this question of a legacy which has to bring about a certain aesthetic revolution, which can aid political radicality in art. So, I mean, these are sort of course, visual aspects which I think Douglas was interested in, and in my own practice, one wants to just bring those questions to the foreground.
Thank you so much, Isaac. I think that's a beautiful way to wrap up this evening's event. And I'm afraid in the interest of time, I'll have to draw the questions to a close, but I know there were many other great questions and comments. Thank you to everyone in the audience for contributing to this evening's discussion. And Also to my colleagues working behind the scenes at Edinburgh Art Festival, Isaac Julian Studio and National Galleries of Scotland, who made both this keynote and the exhibition itself possible. And finally, of course, our warmest thanks go to Isaac and Celeste for welcoming us all into their collaborative dialogue, which has been a real privilege to witness and learn from. Thank you all for joining us. Goodbye.